Hi, Jamie Cowen here to talk with you today about the other. Now, I grew up in the Maryland suburbs of Washington, D.C. It was an all-white neighborhood, most of whom were Jews, actually. My elementary school was all white. And I still remember in the mid-1960s when an Asian family moved into the neighborhood. All the parents in the neighborhood went into a crisis, thinking that the properties were going to suddenly devalue. As it turned out, this Asian family had the first color television in the entire neighborhood, and so they became quite popular, and their son became a very good friend of mine. Anyway, high school I went to in the same neighborhood I still remember that there was one African American student who was a friend of mine. I had to count them through the yearbook to find out how many African Americans we actually had in our graduating class. So out of a class of 580 students, 5 were African Americans. And during the same period, in the 1960s, my father was working in the Congress. And during the summers, I worked there also. And so we would drive from the Maryland suburbs where we lived through Washington, D.C. to park at the Capitol. During the same period, of course, 1968, was when Martin Luther King was assassinated. And there were riots, as you might recall, all over the country, including in Washington, D.C. A few weeks after the riots were quieted down, I took a drive through D.C., especially going down 14th Street, which is where the center of the riots were. And wow, what I saw was unbelievable. I mean, block after block of blackened out businesses and homes. I mean, it was really tragic. And that was when I realized for the first time about the other. In other words, that this was a world that I was completely unfamiliar with. I grew up in white suburban America, and yet I drove every day through black DC, completely blind and unaware of the surroundings of those neighborhoods. It was in 1969 when I became a follower of Yeshua, Jesus, at the all-white high school that I was a part of. And 3 years later, while in college, my family moved to a wealthier suburb in Washington, D.C. It was during that time that I began attending an Episcopal, charismatic Episcopal church. And through that church, they birthed a large community outreach among the youth. All white suburban kids would come, including some Jewish kids, would come to this outreach. It was really a fantastic time. And then suddenly a black brother showed up whose name was Clifford Barnett. As it turned out, he was from an isolated black community that was actually just down the road from the church. It was a community called Scotland. It was formed by former slaves. It was built in the late 1800s by these slaves. It was as an agricultural community in the outskirts of Washington, D.C. But by the 1950s and 60s, the developers were pushing more into the suburbs of Washington and building larger and larger homes. And Scotland became a target of a lot of the developers, but the Scotland residents would not sell out. And so it became kind of a poor black island in the middle of a wealthy white community. Now, I knew nothing about it until Clifford showed up at that youth group. It was during that period that he became a valuable participant and actually leader in the youth group, and he introduced a series of black gospel tunes to the group. It was wonderful. He actually came from a church that was just across the street from this Scotland community. It was called the Scotland AME Zion Church, which is a black denomination. He invited us to come to some of their services, which we did. And wow, what an experience. They were powerful, joyful, lots of amens. But this was the other. It was in 1989 to 90 that we moved to Richmond, Virginia from Washington, D.C. to lead at that time the fledgling Messianic Jewish congregation, which was to become Tikvat Israel. Until 1989, I had never been in Richmond, Virginia. But on an early trip to the city, I saw the famous Monument Avenue, where statues of Confederate war heroes had been erected during the late 19th and earliest 20th centuries. They included Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, Robert E. Lee, and Stonewall Jackson, which was actually just down the street from where our congregation was to eventually reside. Honestly, my family and I were appalled at these statues. But Richmond was very different than Washington, D.C. D.C. was a cosmopolitan city. Richmond was smaller, more parochial, and definitely black and white, very separate. In the early 1990s, Richmond was becoming, unfortunately, the murder capital of the United States. So I joined a group of pastors for prayer for the city. That included a series of African American pastors from the inner city and white pastors from the suburbs. Some of the African American pastors were actually veterans of the Civil Rights Movement. And I listened to their experiences, which were completely unique and I'd never heard of before because they were from the other. It was their people that were getting murdered on the streets. We prayed weekly for several years. And you know what? The city changed. Race relations improved. The murder rate dropped. Government institutions changed. And now, ironically, over 25 years later, those Confederate statues are coming down. It was around the same time that I began teaching Jewish history around the world. Often, we had some Christians attending these classes that I was teaching. I was teaching them mostly in Messianic Jewish Bible schools, but Christians from the local community would attend. And history is understood completely differently by Christians than Jews. Christianity is the dominant religion of the United States and has been since the founding of the Republic. For Jews, at least until recently, the history of Christianity has been a disaster. And often my students would be weeping as I described what so-called Christians did to Jews up through the 20th century. My audiences had never heard of this. Of course, the Jews knew about it, and that was the reason that they had rejected Jesus as being the Messiah. For most of history, Jews were the other. They had different experiences and different narratives. When we moved to Israel 8.5 years ago, I came because we felt the call of God on our lives. We believed that God had given Israel to the Jewish people. We live in the north, in the Jezreel Valley. The law office that I created is in Petah Tikva, which is in the center, right outside of Tel Aviv. To get there, you have to drive along the northern part of the West Bank, where the Palestinians live. And then for the rest of the trip, I travel along the western border of the West Bank, where the security fences and walls were erected to prevent the incursion of terrorists. I remember early on while traveling to work that I would be looking at the towns on the other side of the barrier, and I'd be wondering about them. Like, what was life like there on the other side for the other? Shortly after moving, I was invited to a reconciliation conference with Messianic Jews and Palestinian Christians. I found myself at theological odds with the Palestinians. However, I could not discount their experience, their narrative. In Israel, they are the other. Their experience today is similar to the African American experience in the 1950s. And now that comes to the tragedy of George Floyd. You see, he is the other for white America. Many white Americans believe that except for a few bad apples, policing in the United States is fair and not racist. But the experience of Black America is very different. In most Black communities, police are feared and not trusted. In recent reconciliation conferences, again between Messianic Jews and Palestinian Christians, where Palestinian Christians accuse Israel of being a racist state and military occupiers, honestly, that is very hard to hear. Messianic Jews are proud of Israel. We're proud of the military. We're proud as Messianic Jews to be part of God's plan to return the Jews to the Promised Land. Our response to their accusations is often to point out the corruption in the Palestinian government or missed opportunities for peace, or to say that the overall condition of the Arabs in Israel is far better than compared to their brethren in the Arab world. But the problem is, as the dominant group in culture, we are invalidating the very real experiences of the other. The fact that we believe God returned the Jews to the promised land doesn't make the Palestinian Christians happy when their properties are illegally taken by some of those same returnees. So too, the fact that the lives of many African Americans has dramatically improved since the 1950s doesn't negate the fact that the police brutality toward this community is way disproportionate to the dominant white community. The problem is our experience and our narrative. You see, I grew up as a white person in a white community in a dominant white country. My experience is radically different than the black community because they're the other. Where am I going with this? I think we're all familiar with the story of the Good Samaritan. Jesus was asked a question by a listener, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus said, "You're to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and you're to love your neighbor as yourself." Then there was a follow-up question. Who's my neighbor? That's when Jesus shared the Good Samaritan story. As if we all remember, there's a dude who's beaten up, robbed, and is left for dead on the road. Along comes some religious people who see him and they ignore him. And then the other of Jesus' day, a Samaritan, comes along, has mercy on the guy, carries him to safety, and pays for his care. So who is the neighbor? The other of Jesus' day. As followers of Yeshua, we should always be on the lookout for the other, to love the other. The other often has a different experience than us, and their narrative may be very different. To the dominant group, the other's narrative can sound very threatening to our experience, our reality, and our narrative. Rather than defending our narrative, we must hear the other, be willing to adjust our own narrative, which honestly is very difficult, and then help make changes to the other's experience become a better reality. The dominant group is not the persecuted group, though when our narrative is threatened, it might seem that way. The dominant group, or at least their representatives, have been the persecutors. When things balance out, meaning that the dominant group is no longer as dominant, the dominant group will often claim that they're being persecuted because their privileged status is being challenged. When the dominant group becomes challenged by the other, this is where real change can begin. Yeshua said, "I didn't come for the healthy, but rather the sick." The other has been sick for a long time. The other are those described by Yeshua as being on the highways and byways who are invited to the Lamb's wedding feast, the Lamb of God's wedding feast. For real change to occur, the first step is to recognize that there is the other. Then listen to the other. Then be willing to change your narrative. Then work with the other to make real changes in the experiences of the other. Isn't this kind of what Yeshua did when he came to earth from heaven? He listened to us. He sympathized with us. He showed us a better way. And then he laid down his life for us in order for us to have a new reality. Are you willing to do that for the other? I hope so. Thank you, and see you next time.